Okay, cool. We're recording.
Cool. All right, Mike, you're welcome to kick it off then.
Cool. Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Elias, and I wanted to first thank Devin for the invitation this month to share what I'm working on. I'd like to postpone sharing about my background until the end, so I'll just kick into it here. The premise from what I'm working on is that we're all aware of a sort of crisis of credibility given corporate media and fake news and Facebook and Twitter censoring things. And there's this big crisis about how do we handle this? How do we create common knowledge? And how do we get back to more of a feeling of sharing a narrative culturally? Because it seems like nothing that we used to rely on can work anymore. And my theory about that is that it's very much analogous to Bitcoin with currency and central banks. So in the same way that central banks have had sole dominion over the creation of money and printing of fiat currencies ever since they were invented, and that was the best system that we could have until now, media corporations and governments have had that same kind of absolute control over public narratives, and that has been the best that we could do until now. And now that everybody has technology that allows us to speak and do investigative research, and the incentives of media and journalism are changing and are basically inadequate to the goal of informing the public, we have to transition from this sort of absolute control over narrative by a few parties to a decentralized control over the public narrative. So what I'm building is a tool to facilitate that. First, I just want to make sure that what I'm describing so far is pretty much clear, that we're all, that makes sense so far. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes
sense.
sense. There are a couple of people
Cool.
as well in one of our chats that were really excited about what you're working on. So.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you. I'm glad you're here. So, yes, basically until now, it's not important. It's not real until the New York Times says it, or insert corporate media publication here. And it's simply inadequate for the world that we live in now. So what I'm building is called Idea Market. And the concept for it is that it's a public decentralized market where through investment, the general public can curate credibility and, by extension, public narratives. So it's modeled sort of like Reddit, which was, kind of a breakthrough for me when I discovered it, 5 or 6 years ago, in that it seemed, wow, you could really, have a crowd curate things here. And then after 6 or 12 months of my being there, they published a study showing, the most addicted cities on Reddit, and they accidentally included a little Air Force base called Eglin Air Force Base in Arkansas. And it turns out that they're a hotbed for social media and information manipulation research and things like that for, the Air Force. And it's, there's a lot of psyops and weird social manipulation going on there. A lot of people are familiar with the Clinton campaign hiring a team of web commenters called Correct the Record to go to Reddit and try to shape the narrative and stuff like that. And of course, Reddit is owned now by Condé Nast, so things get deleted and blah, blah, blah. The concept is wonderful, but it's incredibly centralized and incapable of doing what it could do in theory. So what I'm building is kind of an upgrade to Reddit, hopefully, to allow the public to curate the public narrative and to create credibility in a decentralized way that involves investment risk. So idea markets, and I'll share my screen now to kind of give an example of what it looks like. Let's see. Is this working? I'm not sure. Yeah. Can we all see this screen now?
Yep, we can see it.
Cool. So as you can see, it's kind of like Reddit or CoinMarketCap. you have URLs of publications on the left, and they are ranked by market cap in the center. And the way you upvote and downvote is only by buying and selling tokens that are created on a bonding curve. The interesting part about this is that the tokens are not only do they represent the publication. So New York Times has its own token that's on a bonding curve. Fox News has its own token that's on a bonding curve. And the price of the token is directly related to the amount of tokens in circulation. So the more people who have bought into a thing, the more expensive it is to buy that same amount of tokens later on. Now, to keep this going in sort of a perpetual fashion so that people aren't just pump and dumping, so that there's actually an investment case for publications that you think will last a long time at the top, the money that is used to buy any token on idea markets goes into a compound pool and earns interest. And that interest is disproportionately distributed to holders of the top few tokens. So the money that goes into buying the bottom, 98, 99% of tokens adds up to quite a lot, and that earns interest, and then that interest is distributed to the token holders of the top very few. So that sort of provides an income case for top tokens and sort of interferes with the Keynesian beauty contest problem and lessens that a whole lot. I'll just pause for a second here to see if all that makes sense so far. I will take from silence that there are no horrible, glaring questions and confusions.
If any of you have questions as well during the presentation, you're welcome to drop them into the chat where you introduce yourself. So if anything's unclear or if anything that Mike says isn't, you have a question about, we can also touch base on at the end.
Cool. And I'm looking at my screen here, so I might not necessarily see the questions while the screen share is on, but I'll try to get to you soon, I promise. So the reason that I have hope for this and not really anything else is that even if centralized corporations like Facebook or the New York Times or Google or somebody that we don't even know about yet tries to do some kind of fact-checking algorithm or AI that connects credible, quote-unquote, publications with other articles to sort of see what the original sources of things are, we're still trusting the developers of these algorithms and whoever else to decide on the public's behalf what to believe. And that's just not really acceptable anymore. And I think the recent Jeffrey Epstein scandals are making that come to a head. It's sort of a chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks kind of moment. Everybody is kind of crying out for a new way of publicly deciding what to believe and what the narratives are. And I think an open market that is uncensorable and that provides a sort of fulcrum, a sort of leverage for anybody or any ideological group to be a part of the conversation on equal footing with all others, and where ideas can gain prominence based on risk, which is basically an objective measure of sincere belief, of genuine, well-researched, honest interest. That is the way to go here. Another benefit is it changes the incentives a great deal. Right now, and in the past, when looking for narratives, when deciding what to believe, we typically have looked for what's overvalued. What do the big corporations say? What does the New York Times say? What narrative has the biggest play already? When we're looking for investments, we tend to look for what's undervalued. What narratives and ideas and facts are very useful and not well acknowledged. And by having an investment-based public market whereby credibility and by extension, attention is assigned, it provides this incentive structure for a continual improvement of common knowledge. People are always searching for what is not here yet that should be, or what is too prominent, what can I find a superior alternative to? And the market incentives where, you know, if you invest early in a token that represents a publication that has some extremely useful narrative or research or something like that, there will be people looking for low valued publications in the attempt to catch them early. I call this venture philosophy. There's an incentive to look for what's undervalued to sort of counterbalance the incentive to avoid being called a crackpot. You know, right now, if you look for that stuff, you get called a crackpot, and that's changing a little bit, but it's not really official yet. There's still a lot of sort of danger in seeking outliers like that. But if there can be a sort of venture capital investment type case for it and a financial motive that sort of creates a coincidence of wants between ideological groups, it creates an incentive for public open-mindedness, investigation, and it makes understanding alternative viewpoints a market necessity. It makes it a financial necessity. I have a few quick graphs here to show the way that ID markets change the incentives around deciding what to believe. They help create ideological consensus, because if you don't understand the viewpoints that are competing with yours, that's a huge risk. You have to actually understand and empathize with people who believe something different than you. It undermines propaganda by, over time, the platforms that deserve trust will earn that trust, and those that don't will lose it. And ultimately, it solves fake news by making credibility extremely expensive to fake. If you want to publish, you know, one article that says, you know, Senator so-and-so had an affair with so-and-so, you'd probably have to put up at least, you know, several $1 million, maybe even a lot more, in order for it to look like that article came from a publication that has public trust. So without really any effort or policing or monitoring, it makes fake news a pretty difficult to impossible thing to succeed with. So I hope that's a pretty clear summary of idea markets, what they are, how they work, and why I think they're cool. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Cool, thank you so much, Mike. So everyone on the call, if you'd like to maybe unmute yourselves if you have any questions, or if you have any thoughts on the ideas market, we can maybe get a little bit of discussion going, because we're still within time here.
I guess I'll start. Thanks a lot, Mike. That was amazing. Just a quick one, maybe a two-parter. Which bonding curve implementation are you using, the slope graph or connector weight?
I'm sorry, you're cracking up a little bit here. I just want to make sure I understand the question.
Sorry about that. I was just asking which bonding curve implementation you guys are using.
I want to make sure I get the best answer I can for you on that. I know that I can give you the specifications in that the first 10,000 tokens for a given publication are $1 each, and then the price increases by 1 cent for every 100 new tokens minted. So that's as specific as I can get. As for which implementation we use to create that, I will have to consult my tech team. I'm not actually a developer, so I want to make sure to not mislead anybody here by accident.
That's all good. Yeah, and it kind of sounds like it's a kind of customized curve type, almost.
Yeah. And in any case, I'll leave the ideamarkets.org link here in the chat so that people can follow up if you like. I'm also interested in creating a Gitcoin grant, which I just heard was made public so that anybody can create one for their project. I'm interested in following up on that, and would appreciate any support and participation. I really respect all the work that you guys are doing in curation markets, and wouldn't be here without it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. You said at the beginning that you'd end off with maybe a little bit of a background about.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for reminding me. So I've only been in blockchain for about 2 years. I started out doing operations for a healthcare ICO founded by a couple of Stanford faculty members that did not actually end up going very far. We were kind of late to the hype, and the timing wasn't good, and there's no chance you would have heard of us. And after that, I was a biz dev consultant for a China-based blockchain consultancy that had a good run of success, but made too much money too quickly and hired too many people and lost it all when the markets reversed. And since then, I've worked for, I've been an investment associate for one of the founders of BitAngels. And now I am doing business development for an extremely cool project called Bionic Trader, which is a 3D trading platform. And links to that are on my Twitter profile as well. So my work doing biz dev for Bionic Trader is pretty much unrelated to this Idea Marketers project. It's a passion project that I've been working on kind of by myself for about a year. And I'm happy that we're making a lot of progress, and actually, hopefully not far from launch. The platform is mostly built, and it's just a matter of testing right now.
Okay, brilliant. I think most of the people that start with Curation Market started as a passion project and grows into something great from there. But yeah, thank you so much, Mike, for your time and for your presentation. I found it really interesting. I'm sure everyone else did as well. If you can please just pop in your details into the chat and maybe how people can reach you, your Twitter, and then the Ideas market page as well that you referred to.
Sounds
Mike,
good.
Mike,
Thank you so much.
question?
Yeah, please.
Oh, sure, great. Brendan here. That's quite phenomenal. The question that I have is, where do you see this? How do I say this? This is obviously going to have a tremendous impact on society. Have you thought much about where or how big of a disruption you see all this? I mean, it's pretty profound stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, I think if it ends up being as disruptive as it could be, I think that would be great. It just I'd like to. Man, I'm sorry. What exactly is your question? Have I considered how big it could be?
Well, have you thought about the social implications?
Yeah,
I mean, it's a little hard to get there, but I mean,
sure.
Yeah, there's when you start to think about what all of this stuff means and implies, we end up in a very different place in terms of how society is structured. And I was wondering what your thoughts on that at this very infinitesimally small juncture that we're at right now.
Yeah. So I'm hoping it will make outrage as a sort of self-soothing mechanism kind of less satisfying. I'm hoping that there will come sort of a fork where it's possible through social media to see who is putting their money where their mouth is. And I mean that in a more than it sounds. So that it actually costs something to express an opinion, especially if you're an influencer and are basically taking some responsibility for calls and what their beliefs are and what their actions may be. And it ends up being a transition from an epistemology that's sort of monarchical, where there's a top-down authority telling you what the facts are, to an epistemology that I think more reflects reality, which is risk-based. We're not dealing in matters of certainty or authority. We're dealing in matters of what's my best guess given the information that we have of what the narrative is, of what the necessary action is. And it acknowledges the inherent tentativeness of human knowledge and discovery and epistemology, in a way that the current authoritative landscape cannot. Does that make sense? Is that helpful?
Yes, it actually is. You know, it's interesting in all this because one of the things that I see in a number of different domains, this one included, is there's a great grounding of, you know, like boots on the ground, like taking a lot of the stuff that we had in the early days of the web and somehow grounding them to people, grounding them to things, and it's all quite fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited about the capacity of DeFi and curation markets to do that as well.
Great. Yeah, I'll reach out to you.
Thanks so much. I look forward to it. I'll drop my information in the chat.
Another one for
Great.
me, Mike. Like Brendan was mentioning taking it like forward and seeing it develop. I think there's a huge capacity for something like a Reddit style or a publication system that is quite granular, where people are almost staking for their publications and they can lose it if it's fake news. You know, I think it's something that society kind of needs these days, because anyone can produce a publication that is damaging, and they can also quash or squash publications that are, you know, truthful. So I think it's you know, something to develop on, you know, down the line, and it can work quite well with your ideas market.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Oh, perfect. So in the interest of just sticking with time, I'm going to move ahead to our second speaker. If you guys do still have any other questions for Mike, please feel free to drop them into the chat or to message him directly. So moving ahead, I just wanted to welcome Billy Rennekamp from Clovers Network, who's going to be our second presenter. So Billy, I think I'm just going to hand straight over to you. You're welcome to share your screen.
Hi there. Let me see. I got two apps open. Is this?
I think this is probably also the second Curation Markets call you've presented on with us before.
So you guys can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. I'm sharing my screen. And is that visible?
Cool. Yeah, we can see you perfect.
Cool. So I'm going to be talking about Clovers Network with the tagline "Search as Sport." But before I get into that, first I'd like to say hello. Thanks for having me, and I'm sorry I'm late. I had a meeting that went over, and glad that I got here when I did, but wish I was able to see more of the previous one, but glad that it's being recorded, so we'll be able to catch up that way. So a little about myself. I do a lot of things in the space, but most of the time these days I'm working with Cosmos Network. I've also previously worked with Aragon Black to implement batch bonding curves on their continuous organization framework. I worked with Gnosis on atomic arbitrages on their DEX. Author of EIP 1633, the refundable token, as well as a couple other hackathon projects, ENS Nifty and Meme Lords. But today I'm talking about Clovers Project, which is the project that got me into the space originally. It's been built by myself and Alan Wu, Everett Williams, Nicholas Court, part of Ben Studio, with CAD help from Corey Levinson. Also made possible with support from the Ethereum Community Fund, Fundación Escotal Baracol, Pioneerworks, and L4. So at its core, Clovers is a game that uses what I call proof of search. And this is the replacement of proof of work hashing algorithm with the rules of the board game Othello Reversi. This is a super simple game. It's a maximum of 64 moves. It's a little bit like a mixture between tic-tac-toe and Go. And what's nice about it is that it, where's my control? It's a super simple game, but it has a very, very large game tree, which is why it was used for early AI research, because you couldn't just brute force finding the best possible move just because there were too many moves. So while it was very, very easy to write the program on early computers, it was very difficult to do the brute force stuff. So you had to really think about what would an intelligent player do. So that was obviously a big topic with early AI. So it was used in that. It didn't take long for a computer to beat the world's best Othello player. So it dropped out of that race pretty early on, but there's still a very active human-to-human Othello community. But what's nice about this game is that it works really well like a trapdoor hash function. And so if you could think of the chess notation, the moves required to play this board game on the right, you can see it's a little bit like a private key that results in a public key, which is the end result of the board, or similar sort of like a hash function that has similar properties to like the Nakamoto consensus and Ethereum and Bitcoin, where you're looking for a resulting hash that begins with a bunch of zeros. In this situation, instead of looking for a bunch of zeros, you can look for certain qualities of the final results of the game while basically making it impossible to reverse engineer. So really quickly, I thought I might click through the Clovers Network tutorial. Brief guide on these cryptographic icons in the Clovers Network. So this is meant to be seen before you really know anything about what I just mentioned. But you'll see that the basics of the dApp is that you generate them in your browser. This is one, great job. Do another one. Sometimes they result as a white background. Sometimes they result as a black background. Sometimes they result as a gray background. And that has to do with the actual board game that you can see being played there. If the white player was the winner, the background is white. If the black player was the winner, the background is black. If it's a tie, it's gray. So these three clovers just got generated, and by default for this tutorial, they got added to your basket. So they'll remain in your basket even after this tutorial. Now let's say, for example, you found a symmetrical clover. Those previous three were all asymmetrical. This is a symmetrical on x equals 0. It's a perpendicular symmetry. And you can see that there's a reward attached to this. This clover is currently worth 0.22 clover coins, which is about 6 cents. I'll go into more how we provide liquidity for these tokens, but the long and the short of it is a bonding curve. So you can look back at your previous clovers, and while they don't come with a instant reward, you might still want to collect them or sell them. And this is sort of my larger hope for the game. While there's a sort of cash in hand idea of finding symmetrical clovers, I think there's like a much more engaging long-term version of the game related to asymmetrical clovers, but I'll get into that more in a second. But to keep or sell a clover, first you need to register it, and this is basically the process of putting it onto a blockchain. Once it's registered, it appears on your public profile, basics of social networks, and you can sell it in the feed, which is kind of like an open marketplace. The garden is the space where you would generate new clovers in slow time. It seeds new clovers as you scroll. You can save them to your basket like we just similarly did. And then there's also the concept of the pig, which is basically a miner, and it sniffs out rare clovers in the background. It's kind of running ahead of you in the garden, searching for only symmetrical clovers that have cash in hand payout. So this is the sort of closing of have fun, but quickly I'll jump to the garden. You can see these are all brand new clovers getting generated in real time. Very unlikely you're going to hit a symmetrical one here, but might be that through the act of pareidolia, the sort of pattern recognition that humans are so excited about, finding shapes in clouds, etc., you might see something that you are excited about, or find some other weird properties. And I also think this is, when it comes to sort of negative time passing on the internet, I think this is sort of like a weirdly nice way to pass your time on the internet, kind of like passively watching clouds or something like that. But I'll go back to, does anybody know how to move this zoom bar from the top of the screen? It's blocking out half of my shit. Is that a thing?
Yeah, I think you should be able to drag and drop it somewhere.
It doesn't give me any sort of draggable interface.
Is it hooked to your window?
Let's see if I try to resize. Nope. Nice, I can barely click the tab, so I'm back. So what's nice about using a blockchain like Ethereum is that you have these protocol standards like the NFT standard. So these are all NFTs, which means that they'll by default already be sellable on OpenSea. They'll show up in your Coinbase wallet. They'll show up in any block explorer that's aware of the format. This is a really nice form of interoperability across platforms. Has a concept of self-sovereignty. It's not about me keeping track of the NFTs. It's a community of Ethereum miners who are basically keeping track of it. Allows for things like digital scarcity and authentication. Just to reference again, this system is incentivized to find clovers in general, but especially symmetrical ones. There's 5 types of symmetry in this system, and these are paid with a Clover coin, ERC20 called Clover coin, which is an inflationary token. And the idea of having a token on a project like this at all is because it gives you a lot more levers to pull in different ways that can be really exciting. One of those levers is the bonding curve that handles the exchange of Clover coins for the underlying Ether. And if you're all on this call, you know the basics behind this, so I won't go into that. But something that's a little bit special about this one is that it's an adjustable bonding curve. So because it's inflationary, the clovers that get minted for finding symmetrical clovers, the reward clover coins, basically increase the coins in circulation while not increasing the amount of collateral that's inside of there. And so the shape of the curve is constantly adjusted based on the types of activity that are taking place inside the game. So if a lot of people are just finding symmetrical clovers and exchanging them for Ether, the value per token will decrease, even though the coins in circulation are increasing. Whereas there's 2 different or 3 different events inside the game which might convince users to burn tokens. And in doing that, they basically decrease the coins in supply while keeping the collateral the same, which results in an increase in price. At a very high level, this is kind of the user flow of the game, which looks probably pretty confusing. So I'm going to try to break it down a little bit. By these entities, you have a player who's maybe going through the garden to find clovers, maybe using the pig. They are taking rewards for symmetrical clovers. They might also be taking risks on subjective value, which means they might find an asymmetrical clover that does not allow them to cash out, or even a symmetrical clover that they think is worth more than the payout. And then they might add contextual value, like naming it, pointing out, what the clover looks like, maybe adding comments, putting it in an album, having likes and things like that. The garden I mentioned is this sort of mining area, slow mining. It's where you get to see every single clover generated instead of just sifting out the symmetrical ones. And this is where you have a lot more variety and potential for these subjective value claims. And I mentioned before the act of pareidolia. It's pattern recognition, like watching clouds. The pig was the mining tool. It's going really fast through your garden, searching only for symmetrical clovers, and it's disregarding anything that's not symmetrical. This is mostly good for objective value mining, the immediate payouts. And a miner is sort of another version of a player you can think of. A miner would be somebody who might interact with the system with purely economic intentions. They only plan on extracting money, so they would always cash out symmetrical clovers as long as the payout is more than the cost of the gas to register it. And so there's a couple stories you can imagine with all these players that begin from registering a clover. Let's take story 1, using the example of the player. He might find a clover, likes the clover. If they decide to keep it, they would burn a fee in order to keep it. So that's over here. That fee is paid in Clover coin, which decreases the token supply. They keep that clover. In this scenario, we're just saying because they like the way it looks. And that's the end of it. They go on their merry way. Story number 2, same player, different player might find a clover, see the potential on that clover, decide to burn the fee to keep it, similar to the first scenario. But they might then sort of add this contextual value, name, comments, albums, likes. Maybe they put it in a context that makes it really exciting. Maybe they generate it as t-shirts or 3D files or something to create a story or a narrative around the fact that this shape represents some more interesting, larger conversation. And then they might put it onto a marketplace where that larger value has now been recognized and they might be able to capitalize on it. Story 3 is the player or the miner in the scenario who's just finding a clover that has an immediate reward payout. So they will exchange it. At this point, the clover becomes owned by the contract, basically an orphan clover. And as an orphan clover, it is immediately put up for sale on the market for a markup from what the reward was. So that if at a future date it is sold, that amount paid for it gets burned. So that's a token sink. When the player keeps a clover, that's a token sink. And when anybody accepts a reward for the clover, that's an inflation event. So that sort of results in this larger scheme. And the goal of the project is basically to generate as many clovers as possible. And one of the ways to do that, the going thinking is to create this sort of cyclical economy that self-balances so that there's always some reward for generating new ones. And there's always an opportunity for players to interact or use those clovers in other ways to continue the sort of process of generating them. So we launched in August, and since then, I've collected a couple stats. We were really excited to see over 5,000 transactions on the first day and 20,000 in the first 5 days. It was a big rush. We heard from Dapper Labs that they subsidized $3,000 in fees on day one before they blocked us from their app, their wallet. There were over 20,000 new clovers in the first 3 weeks. At this point, there are 447 clovers holders and total of 41,696 clovers in circulation. There's 33,450 clover coins in circulation. 28,000 of those belong to, I call it a foundation, but it's just the initial purchase of clovers to start the bonding curve. And that was the leftover results of the Ethereum Community Fund grant they received. So that was $10,000 worth of Ether that went into making the first purchase of Clover coins, which resulted in those 28,000. So all of this sort of inflation is mostly, chipping away at the value held by the foundation. The token price is currently at 0.0014, which is 26 cents. There's been a price drop of 0.0006 ETH since launch, which is today's price around 11 cents. There's been 3 contract upgrades since the launch, some of them associated to different hacks that have occurred, rather friendly hacks. We can talk about those if you'd like. 4 podcasts that are out there, Telegram group with over 100 members, Discord that's community run, not initiated by me, that has over 100 members. The average session duration is over 10 minutes, which is kind of remarkable for most website usage. There's only 4 Ether of total volume on OpenSea. You could say only or a lot, depending on your perspective. And the average price on OpenSea is 0.1 Ether. There's a few new features, and we've received 1 new grant since launching. As well as a meme. Somebody made a meme about receiving asymmetrical versus symmetrical clovers from the big. We also had a really interesting interaction with gas prices. So as I mentioned before, that a miner would only register a clover if the reward is greater than the cost to mint that. And if anybody remembers this debacle with Fairwin over the last month or so, a sort of runaway Ponzi scheme that ended up bloating the mempool and having gas prices sort of rocket. You can see the sort of number of clovers getting registered every day as compared to the price of gas in the background. I'm sure there's more than one reason that these correlations would occur, but you could very much see that it was no longer profitable for many people to interact with the system. And so until the gas price dropped down again, there was very little activity for this period of Fairwin, which was discouraging, but also very interesting to see how directly proportional gas costs were to the system, and brought up a lot of issues about sovereignty with gas costs and shared state and shared resources and things like that. Just some quick highlights, some of my favorite symmetrical clovers which have popped up since the launch. This sort of top right one with the beard has become an icon on the Discord. I'm a big fan of this weird tier pattern. These ones down here in this I don't know if you can see my mouse, but in the middle right side is a symmetrical clover that's symmetrical on 5 different lines. So it's diagonal in both ways, perpendicular in both ways, and it's rotational. It also contains green squares, which are much rarer. And for a while, you could see that it was only profitable at those high gas prices for clovers that had 5 symmetries, which result in the largest reward payout. And so whenever a Clover did come in, it was really kind of amazing to see that it was these ultra rare, super insanely hard to find, must have had like a supercomputer running to find them. As well as just some other nice patterns that came through. Like I mentioned, these gray ones are the ties inside the hashing algorithm of the board game. Bitcoin logo on the bottom left. The asymmetrical ones are the ones that I've been much more excited about. Kind of this top left, sorry, is it chat's coming through? Great. The turtle, top left, this one's kind of a spy versus spy, obvious face. This is like an equestrian horse. This is a unicorn cat. There's a sort of a dog with a floppy ear in the middle left. Cell phone on a selfie stick. Cat. This green one is one of my favorites. I don't know if you can see it, but I think it looks a lot like a skydiving turtle. Here, I think this looks a bit like a Loch Ness Monster sort of creature going in and out of the water. Baby lamb jumping, I think a cigarette, oops. High heel, just a dude with a face. Bottom right one looks kind of like a Mario character playing golf. I don't know if anybody can see that. But this is, I think, where the active, like, real sort of creativity and interesting stories come to play. You can see some players strictly interact with asymmetrical clovers. Some players are just going for the super rare ones. And it's been really interesting to follow the conversations in Discord about what it means to be rare, why you would look for a rare one, what actually is rare in the system compared to what the system's paying out as rare. What are more equitable configurations of rewards? What are more interesting configurations? And we've been working really hard to incorporate a lot of that feedback. So sort of next steps and upcoming for Clovers. The first one I mentioned, we got this grant from POA Network to utilize their arbitrary message bridge, which is a really exciting sort of way to trustlessly offload certain computation expenses processes from Ethereum to one of the more stable and widely used sidechains, POA or the XDAI sidechain. And the current thinking is to utilize it, especially for no coin onboarding. So users who interact with a game for the first time. Obviously, games are a really great way to engage people who are interacting with new technology and are maybe otherwise intimidated by it. But the problem is that most of the time they need to have some ether themselves to interact with it. The other sort of option is to subsidize their costs with meta transactions, but that can get very expensive and you become sort of a victim of your own success. If you have any sort of real usage, you end up paying a whole lot more than you had hoped, probably. And so a really nice compromise to that user flow that we're excited about building is using POA. And the current thinking is that a new user would land and they would either be generated a burner wallet or opt into Portis or Fortmatic. And then they would be signing meta transactions that are destined for the POA network. So if they find a Clover that they'd like to register, receive a reward for, say, they would sign that meta transaction. It would get submitted to the POA network. These gas costs I'm happy to subsidize because one Ether can pay for around 2 million transactions, Clovers related verification transactions on Proof of Network, Proof of Authority. So that's a much more reasonable sort of subsidy scheme that I'd be happy to cover. So there it'll be able to be verified on chain and it can do full on-chain verification. We actually use a scheme of a trusted third party right now, which is a server that I run. You submit a Clover to that server, it will confirm that it's valid and it actually is the types of symmetry you say it is. It'll sign a voucher basically that allows you to redeem that Clover inside the contract. And that prevents the Clover from having to run the entire hashing function. I mentioned that Othello is a really sort of simple game, which means you actually can register, you can verify the game on Ethereum. It's just that it increases the gas cost to, I think it's something like 1.5 million now, maybe a little bit less, which is not insane, but definitely not ideal. So figuring out different ways to verify these things cheaply has been a big part of the project since the beginning. So in this situation, you could verify fully on chain for dirt cheap. I would pay for that. And POA now has a fully functioning arbitrary message bridge, which means that after it's verified on chain and the POA contract, it would trigger another contract that's on POA, which is the bridge, and say, here's an outgoing message that's destined for the original Ether Clovers contract. So the POA bridge would pick up that transaction. They would submit it on the Ether bridge, and they actually pay for the gas, which is really amazing. So once it hits the Ether bridge contract of the POA side on Ether, it will then forward that message onto the original Ethereum Clovers contract, where it will confirm that this came from the bridge and originated from the sister contract on POA, which will give the user the right to mint that Clover and reward them with a fee or do whatever it is that they had intended from the beginning. So we're really excited to support this system where people can basically show up to the site completely anonymously, start earning Ether completely trustlessly, and then move away from the system after they've basically onboarded to the ecosystem. Some other really exciting developments, we're going to develop a bounty mining system where you basically design a desired Clover and you're able to post that design with a bounty and an expiration. And then other people can contribute to that bounty. And in order to sort of keep it fair about who's paying for it and who's getting to it, the current thinking is to use a dollar auction, which, if you're familiar with, is basically this kind of paradigm that you can follow through with economically logical steps and result in a like illogical outcome in the scenario of auctioning off a dollar. So in this dollar auction scenario, somebody would say, I'm going to sell you this dollar. Anybody can bid on it, but whatever you bid, you have to pay whether you win the dollar or not. So you start bidding way under $1, like, great, I'll bid 50 cents on this dollar. Somebody else like, I'll bid 51 cents, and this continues until 99 cents. And then if you're the one who bid 98, you're like, well, damn, I'm going to be out 98 cents. I might as well just cover my losses by bidding $1. And at that point, the person who bid 99 is like, well, damn, I'm going to be out 99 cents. I'd rather just be out 1 cent. If I win this auction, I get the dollar back. So they might logically bid 101, and this could continue happening until you end up paying way more money than you ever intended. The very last person is mad, but they eventually get that dollar, which is a pretty, I think the optimal scenario in the actual dollar auction is just to not participate. But if you sort of adapt those rules to something where you actually want the outcome and there's not really a proven value for it, like a Clover, I think it can be really interesting because you end up having a lot of different people who are funding the bounty of finding this thing, and only one of them can be the owner at the end. So let it be the person who pays the most, but everybody else who participates also has to sink that money into it. So this might be a kind of exciting and interesting way to fund a single object for a single owner that's paid for by a larger group. The other feature that we're excited about is Precella Mining. So the goal of the project is to get as many Clovers on the register as possible. And there's this other sort of aspect of the Clover coin. So a lot of the choices in the design have been trying to stabilize the price of the Clover coin because that drives further mining. But another way to think about it is that if the goal is to get them registered, we should remove risk from the players who are putting them on the contract. And instead of forcing a user who wants to register a Clover to pay for it, or to risk sort of paying for it until somebody else buys it, there's the idea of a new scheme where you can register a Clover on the contract, but you don't own it until you don't own it and you don't get paid for it until somebody decides to buy it. So they're all kind of sitting in purgatory. They're technically owned by the contract. If somebody does buy it, you receive a portion of the payout. The other portion would get burned to sort of continue helping stabilize the token price. But it would mean that, yeah, you no longer have to risk the cost of the Clover coin to register if you think somebody else would perhaps buy it in the future. So you can register way more with much less risk in that scenario. So that would increase the Clover count, even if it wouldn't necessarily continue fortifying the Clover coin price, because the goal of the project is to register more and more of these Clovers, not to create a really valuable token. So that's the end of the 15-minute presentation. I have a bunch of other slides here related to using CAD to simulate different aspects of the project before launch, as well as some slides about the sort of larger goal and history of the project within an art practice, in which the sort of goal was to create a botnet that convinced a bunch of strangers to mint these Clovers instead of me trying to mint them all by myself. So with that, I would love to open it up to any questions or comments or anything that was unclear and dive into it.
Thank you so much for your time, Billy. Really, really, really interesting, and it's great to see your progress. I want to actually kick off a question quickly, if you guys don't mind, about the hacks that you had. You said you had 3.
Oh, yeah. So the first one was on the launch of the project. Here, I'll put a nice background for us all to look at. So we launched August 20th at midnight, which meant that midnight Central European time. So I was in the studio with my collaborators on it, and we'd already deployed the contracts, but they were all set to be paused. And at that point in the project, we used, similar to I mentioned, this sort of trusted third party who signs a message that says, yes, this is a valid Clover. Used to be that the user would make that claim directly on the contract, and then the Oracle bot that I had running would confirm it and then send a follow-up transaction to finalize the whole system. So every Clover registration took basically 2 transactions, one from the user and one from this like trusted entity. By the way, there was always the method of a user verifying fully on chain with that kind of 1 million gas, which was 100% trustless. But we wanted to provide, a less decentralized but better user experience option from the beginning as well, which is why we had this sort of mediated version. But so in that previous version, I had an account which needed to have a little bit of Ether in it, and the user would prepay a little bit of Ether in their first transaction that would then be used by my sort of Oracle bot in order that the Oracle bot didn't run out of money. But it had to have a little bit of money to begin with. And of course, we'd been running this on test networks forever. And one of the nights before, I remember falling asleep with 2 hours of sleep the night before and 2 hours of sleep the night before that. I'm just so exhausted. And before I closed my eyes thinking oh yeah, don't forget to give money to the mainnet Oracle bot, because we've been dealing with the Rennekamp Oracle bot this whole time. And of course, I completely forgot to do this. So launch happens and it's midnight. We open the live site, we turn off the pause. All these people join and start registering all these Clovers, but none of them are getting that second follow-up transaction. And so I start scurrying around, pulling up all these stats, checking the different things. And I'm like, oh my God, of course, it's the Oracle bot. And so the Oracle bot at that point was the same account as on Rennekamp, but on the mainnet, it had no money. So I immediately sent 1 Ether to that account, and it was immediately removed with a gas price that was almost 0.4 Ether itself, just to ensure that this hacker was able to move money out of this account immediately. And I started reeling, just thinking what's going on? Oh my God, we're 30 seconds into launch and already we have $200 hacked away from us from this 1 Ether that's been removed. And of course I remember that it's this Rennekamp account. And being a Rennekamp account, I've never been that fastidious about protecting the private key. I think at one point it got published to GitHub. It's a known issue, but not a big deal. It's Rennekamp. Of course, in the heat of the moment, I sent all this money to this totally compromised account. So then I had to update the Oracle contract with a new key that was secured, send money to that key, and then the Oracle started running. But at this point, I had 50 Clovers which hadn't been verified. So I had to go to Etherscan and install the Oracle's permissioned key and start manually verifying these things until they went through. It was like having a big dinner party and then realizing that the caterers don't come, and so you're in the kitchen hand cooking hamburgers for hundreds of people or something like that. It was this total mess, but we got through it, and it was a great sort of lesson and success at the end of it to have that big drive at the beginning. And then the first few weeks was sort of putting Band-Aids on other sorts of parts of the infrastructure like that. The Oracle bot was getting overloaded with too many. There was questions about what should the proper gas price be and things like that. So we made a lot of updates around that, which were related to that first hack. And then the other 2 were from a community member, actually the same community member. And they found different flaws in the verification library, the JavaScript library, which my sort of Oracle bot was using to confirm Clovers were valid. And let me think. The first one was that so if you're familiar with the game of Othello, there's 4 starting points, and the game can basically be rotated depending on what those 4 starting points are. So here they are. And you can see it's essentially the same thing, just a translation of them. It's like this T with a little white thing. And so in order to prevent somebody from, let's say, finding a solution on one branch and then just, translating to the 4 sister versions of it and getting the payout for all of those, the game is restricted so that all of them have to come from this single starting point, because otherwise they're all just mirror versions of each other. So this limits the game tree, which also reduces the number of total possible games, which is good to have sort of slightly making it more and more difficult to find symmetrical ones as they get found, limiting that total number. But I realized that was being confirmed on the contract level, but not in the JavaScript level. So this user started registering translations of Clovers that they had, but luckily they were just really into the game. And so they weren't doing it in order to like cash out. They were just doing it because they found a Clover that they loved and they wanted to have it rotated in all 4 different ways. And so they were actually paying money to do this, because you have to burn a fee in order to keep a Clover. So they found an exploit that could have resulted in them getting money, but ended up that they were spending money in order to sort of relish inside of it. So once we patched that, I let the user keep those Clovers because it did no harm really. And it's also nice that they basically discovered the vulnerability. And then the user did it again with another bug that was in the JavaScript library that basically let you brute force really, really bizarre configurations of Clovers. So it had to do with the logic when an invalid move is made, it assumes that it was because it was by the wrong player. Like if it was a move that the black player made that was invalid, the code's like, oh, that must have been the white player's move then. That was a pass. And so it confirms that was possible as the white player, and if it is, then it continues. When actually, it could have just been an invalid move for both players. And so he found this flaw and started shoving through really, really crazy looking ones that only had like 3 moves or 2 moves, just completely impossible games. And I think they registered maybe 50 of those, but in the same way, they were paying to keep them. So it was hard to get mad at them. So we closed that bug, but let them keep those Clovers. So they're all relatively painless hacks. The first one's probably the one that stings the most, but I totally deserve it. So just things keeping the game lively.
Thanks so much. Cool. Does anyone else have any questions? Bradley, sorry, so you just unmuted.
Yeah, Billy, excellent as always. Do I remember an older version of Clovers that was on the pre-sale model, or am I making that up?
The old version of it was, so built at this hackathon like August 2017, and it used a hot potato market. It wasn't quite the pre-sale, but it was like you would register it, and it would go for sale at whatever 1 Clover coin, and it would be purchased, and then it would immediately go for sale by that new user at 2 Clover coin. And if somebody bought it from them at 2, it would immediately be for sale at 4. So you never had the option of not putting it up for sale, and every time it was purchased, it would double the price for the next one, which we thought was really exciting and a really novel market mechanism. But ultimately decided that we would rather adhere to 721, which at that point we felt like you should have control over transferring it and not necessarily have the other one force you to sell it. And if you wanted to enter a market like that, then it should be optional, and that should really take place on an actual marketplace instead of on the place that you just come to register the Clovers.
Got it. Okay. I had one other question, and that's, have you spoken about or documented your method for upgrading your contracts anywhere?
I haven't really. So I don't use the, what is it called? Like a proxy contract, which most people do for upgradability using like a Zeppelin OS or something like that, which is a great method. But I always just kind of felt like brought in too many of these precarious storage slots that could be mixed up or problematic in future deployments if they didn't match up perfectly. And so I have a system where I deployed the 721 and the ERC20 and just made as few alterations to them as possible so that they were sort of well-tested, audited versions of the code. And those are the two contracts which are permanent. And then they have certain addresses that have permission to mint and burn on each of them. And those are controlled by what I call Clover Controller and Club Token Controller, which was an earlier name of Clover Coin. And so those two contracts can be replaced as many times as necessary and just updated on the 721 and the ERC20 so that they know that there's this new contract out there who has authority to mint or to burn, so that the logic around the gameplay, which is where all this sort of logic lives, is able to be changed and upgraded as many times as possible. And that's currently controlled by an owner address, but a future goal as well is to move that owner address onto a multi-sig or to a DAO of members. And with regard to the DAO of members, we're planning on making that not using ERC20 voting tokens, but actually using balances of non-fungible tokens, which has a lot of benefits over the fungible tokens, where fungible tokens are much easier to exchange. So if you were going to, say, do a voting attack where you buy up a bunch of these voting tokens, vote something dastardously for whatever, something terrible for your entity, and then cash out before the fallout has occurred, you are able to sort of attack a network with very little risk. Whereas if they're non-fungible tokens, the idea of like accruing a lot of them, first off, takes a long time. You have to do, a single transaction for each of them. Maybe you can batch them, but you're still going to pay a lot in gas. And the idea of being able to sell them in bulk is very difficult. So if you're thinking of doing anything that harms the value of those tokens, you're going to be stuck with those valueless tokens afterwards. So it's going to cost way, way more to do that sort of attack as opposed to a fungible voting token.
Wow. The upgrade structure is super elegant. That's cool. And man, the voting scheme, that's innovative. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Bradley and Billy. Does anyone else have any other questions? Otherwise, we are running a little bit more over time for this course. So I'm happy to take maybe one or two if there's any. All right. And I think I'm really happy to share. And I just wanted to say again, Billy, thank you so much for joining the call and for your presentation. It was really great having you on the call. I think the last time you were on the call, you were presenting meme lawns.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Cool. So this call will be made available online, and I'll push it out to everyone, I think, tomorrow at some point. So please feel free to like, share, retweet, and pass on the message then.
Awesome.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining. Have a good evening.
Everybody.